Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and my guest today is Carol Milne.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I stumbled on your account on Instagram, and you're doing something very unusual. And I know usually I interview fiber artists, but you took fiber art on the completely different level.
Well, thank you. I started out as a fiber artist. I mean, that was my first love.
So when did you start knitting? How did you learn how to knit?
So I started to knit when I was 10. That was my grandmother taught me. I think I knitted a belt and then probably took a couple of years off and then came back to it. I lived in Montreal and we used to go to I went to a knitting store with my grandmother, and there were these women who seemed really old to me, but looking back probably were, younger than I am now. They're in the back knitting on multiple needles. And I was just mesmerized, that idea of knitting in a round. And so that's when I got hooked on knitting. And I pretty much taught myself everything since then.
When you were teaching yourself, was it through books? How did you teach?
Yeah, a lot of books. Threads magazine used to have a lot of knitting. I mean, I loved Threads magazine. So I would get that and different patterns. And, I love Fair Isle and cable. And so I pretty much tried a bit of everything. And then I've still knit today with fiber.
Right. So going back to your grandmother, what kind of items was she knitting? Was she an amazing knitter?
So both my grandmothers knitted. So my grandmother on my dad's side is the one who originally taught me. And I don't really remember any of her knitting. She taught me to knit, but I don't remember any of her knitting. My grandmother on my mom's side also knit, but she was left-handed. And she knit lots of Afghans, especially, the chevron zigzag ones with different colors. Used terrible yarn, like acrylic, really scratchy, and Fentex. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Used to be popular. I think that's probably one of the first yarns I knitted with from my other grandmother. And I guess I've become a bit of a yarn snob because Fentex is very plasticky, and we used to make slippers and things out of it, which was probably great, really durable. But so that's what my other grandmother used to knit.
Do you remember some of your first projects?
Let me think. Well, the belt, first thing I made was a belt, it was about this big and it was blue and it was really lumpy and uneven. And I knitted, one of my first things must have been a chevron Afghan because of my grandmother. And my great aunt on my dad's side knit, and she gave me this very fine yarn from Scotland. I mean, I don't know what the gauge was, but I knitted a sweater, but I didn't test my gauge beforehand. So it really didn't fit anybody, but that was a thing I remember. It was a beautiful kind of a heather pinkish with this tweedy. It was gorgeous yarn, and then didn't fit, and I didn't want to tear it out.
So when was the idea of trying something different came to you? Well,
so my career, I became a sculptor, and I was mostly interested in large scale casting metal and outdoor work. And I had, when you're doing bronze casting, there's this wax that I can show you some of it. This wax it's long and skinny. It comes in different, widths.
Right.
And I had it in my studio, and this was probably around Christmas time, and I was knitting socks or mittens or something. And I kept looking at this and thinking, looks like yarn. I wonder if I could knit with it. And then that just sent me down the rabbit hole. You can't actually really knit with it because it doesn't stretch like fiber does. But I figured out this process where I could wrap it around a knitting needle and make coils, and then open up the coils and knit by hand. And then and I have done some in bronze, but mostly I just love doing it in glass because of the way you actually see the structure of the knitting. Like the color is, you can probably see behind me, but the color is darker where the stitches overlap.
Right.
So then it becomes to me more of an idea of connections and all these little pieces making something bigger. And so that's kind of, for knitting, that's kind of what knitting is to me, this idea of holding yourself together and bringing things together. And even though that's not what it is, but symbolically or metaphorically, that's.
Well, I've read also on your website that you were discussing the whole like community as knitting as well, that like one thing can tumble down and it like takes the whole structure down, and yet it still stays connected. And
yeah, that's it's I don't tend to think on that plane, it's kind of, but that's what it feels like when I'm doing this. It feels to me like it's about bringing community together, like this grassroots thing that although we all know that each stitch is all part of the whole, but having all these little stitches, and when they're all connected, then you can make something bigger than you can just with individual pieces, especially in glass. If you have an individual piece of glass that sticks out, that's going to be the first piece to break off, because it doesn't have any. Well, you're the engineer. What's that? There's different terms for tensile strength, or it doesn't have that ability to flex at all.
right.
And that's, I guess that lack of glass's ability to flex feels kind of politically where our country has been too. We're connected, but things break, and there's no flexibility to pull it back together, it seems, but
Right.
it's just me philosophizing.
So when you first tried it, right, the very first time you decided to play with it, was it like an immediately successful project?
Oh, no, because glass doesn't want to do this. Glass, when it's molten, is like very thick honey. And so what I'm doing is I'm making something in wax. I make a mold around the wax out of plaster. I melt the glass out of the mold, and then the mold goes in a kiln and I melt glass in. And the glass doesn't melt right in because it has to go through all those zigzaggy connections. So a lot of the first pieces I didn't fill the mold completely. They would stop and not, so I had to figure out how to engineer it, really get the venting so that the air would escape and the glass would go in. And a lot of it is timing. My molds are in the kiln at top temperature for at least 24 hours. And often, if it's a very deep mold, it takes longer, and the fine detail takes longer than the thicker detail.
Right.
And that I just had to learn through trial and error, the
So
hard way.
until you were like satisfied with that first piece that you were like, yes. How long did that process take from the first trial?
Oh, well, I'm pretty flexible. So even when things didn't work out completely, I liked it enough that it kept me going, right? The first piece that I felt, oh, this doesn't have any quote flaws, boy, that probably took at least a year. And still, I still have things that don't turn out right. But I have this attitude that, glass casting is just a mystery, right? And sometimes it doesn't turn out, and you can either just be crushed by that, or you just can see that bit of failure as a feature. That's how I always teach, when I'm teaching classes to students, you have to reframe things, because even nothing in life is perfect, and you just have to go with it and go on to the next one, and maybe the next one will be perfect, or maybe there you shouldn't worry about it being perfect.
Right. Maybe it wasn't meant to be perfect. That's
Right. There's that the Japanese knitting style where they always leave I can't remember the name of it, but they always leave a mistake.
Right.
Uh,
Actually, like I've read that like when they were making Persian rugs, they also would specifically put a mistake there because it was sort of like preventing from evil eye, because if it's
yeah.
like everybody's envious. So it's
Yeah.
a common folklore sort of to have a mistake in handmade item,
Well, and the truth of the matter is most people can't find the mistake. I
Right.
mean, you see it because you've been looking at it every day for months, right? But most people don't see the mistake.
So you wrote a book about how it's done. Why did you decide to write the book?
That was actually my husband took my PowerPoint and turned it into a book because he just thought I needed to kind of trademark what I do because nobody else really doing this. I mean, I'm kind of an open source software kind of person, so that seemed insane to me, but a lot of people don't, they look at it and they don't understand. So the book helps you at least understand. It's time that we do another one because it's outdated, I think, at least the images. And I think I probably should do one that talks more about the details of mold materials. The problem with that is that it's not a one size fits all. It's like, if you scale up, things change in terms of mold material. If you thicker glass versus thinner glass has different properties. So anyway, I'm thinking about that. We'll see.
So you mentioned that you teach.
Well, not lately, but.
Right. But like, who are your students? Are they all knitters?
No, it's a mix. I do have a lot of knitters. Probably when I'm teaching, I would guess half of them are knitters with no glass experience at all. It's in some ways it's easier for them, but there's a steep learning curve. I mean, this process is very messy compared to knitting, and some people hate it. So the knitting part is actually maybe 20% of what I do. I mean, you can do that fairly quickly, especially if you know how to knit. But then I have to, all of the joints you need to melt wax into those joints and, it's like with a soldering iron. And then you have to figure out if you have a large entry, like if you're making a bowl, it has a huge bottom and that becomes, when you flip it over, that's the place where the glass goes in.
Right.
And so those are easier for a student than, like my work often has multiple entry points for the glass and those all have to get cut off. And so the engineering of that is more time consuming and mold making is really messy.
I saw a video where you remove the mold and it looks like an archaeological dig where you like with the basically toothpick removing the plaster from it. How long because like the video is obviously sped up, but how long does it take you to actually remove the mold from something that large?
So if the glass is big, it actually comes off pretty easily. It's the material between the stitches doesn't really move. You have to mechanically remove it. So I can sometimes spend, I don't know, half a day on big pieces. And then sometimes they need a lot more cleanup after that, like cutting off. But small pieces sometimes can take a couple hours. It just depends, I like that part. Like a lot of people, I mean, a big question I get is like, why don't you just soak the whole thing in water? And I've done that, but the mold material doesn't just flake off. It sticks and it gets more gooey if it's wet. So I find it harder to remove. I do, once I get the majority of it off and I can see where the glass is, I have this like small scale pressure washer to get some of the stuff that's in between the stitches. But mostly I like to get it off dry, and it is like archaeology, and it's like Christmas every time. I mean, you never really know the way the colors are going to combine. I mean, I have an idea, but I'm always surprised. So that's a good thing.
So how do you start? Like you start with where the idea comes from of what you're gonna make?
Well, sometimes I don't really have an idea. Sometimes important thing to me is I just work. Even if when I'm not inspired, I just start playing with the wax, and sometimes I come up with an idea. Sometimes I'm thinking, like I make a lot of pieces that I think of as gestural drawings, right? They're small knitted pieces they just have, they're all just varied in how the arms of the knitting needles are going to move. And that just comes from working. I mean, I just let my mind go. And I mean, during COVID, I felt like I was making a lot of pieces that were curved, with little spaces, like a sheltered area. And I mean, that just came from my unconscious. I didn't set out to do that. But sometimes I have a specific idea. Like lately, I made some COVID pieces that are like black cages with ladders coming out, and the ladders light up. And so that came from this whole idea, like we're trapped in a cage and we are the light coming out. And I started with the idea before I made those, but it's like half and half. Sometimes the idea comes first.
So when you need just for fun, when you need home for pleasure, right? What do you need?
So right now I have a couple different things going on. I have a honeycomb shawl that's very fine detailed, drive me crazy. Easy pattern, repeated, but so I've been working on that for a while. I'm working on some kind of Fair Isle knit gloves for Christmas you've probably seen them on Ravelry. One has like a cat that when you put the two hands together, you see the cat, and the other's a dragon. And I've got a sweater. I mean, I've got a lot of projects, but mostly I like stuff that's more complicated. I don't tend to just do stockinette stitch like we were talking about earlier. The problem with more complicated is you need to have the time to work on it. You can't just drop it and pick it up again. So
So like, then how do you have so many projects going on at the same time?
Because I start them and then I get distracted, and I'll get to, I eventually get back to them all mostly, but some of them sit for a long time. I'm working on a brioche thing that's with this colorful yarn combined, different colors. So I've got all these little squares, and I made a lot of them during the beginning of COVID. I mean, I was going to make a house coat. I probably have 200 or so squares, but the thought of having to sew them all together is kind of daunting. So it's just sitting there. Eventually I'll get back.
Do you have like some favorite kind of project that you sort of always gravitate towards?
Knitting wise, it varies. I used to knit a lot of sweaters for my kids when they were smaller, but they're grown now. So, big sweaters take a lot longer. So
You wear your own knits?
I do. Seattle's not the best place to live though for knitting, because unless you make really fine stuff, most sweaters are too heavy for our climate. I do have a lot of knits. Yeah.
So let's go back to the glass thing. So
yeah,
you you exhibited in many places, you in like many galleries. How did it feel like to get that first gig?
Exciting, but I think in my mind I thought, oh, I'm going to get into a gallery and then it's going to be smooth sailing after that. And it's not. Being an artist and marketing your work, they're two different things. And I do some marketing, but I really just want to make the work, and I don't want to make the same thing over and over. So I'm glad my husband has a job. I mean, I laugh, but most artists don't make a living from their work. Right. I mean, they just don't. And I hope to make enough money that I'm not a burden on my family, but I'm not really in it for the money. I'm in it because I love, at least so far, I love glass, and I love the combination of the two, glass and metal, or glass and knitting together. And I'm still interested in creating new things. So,
but like when you think about it as business, right? There are things that pay better. There are things that's like sure way of making money. And then there is things that maybe they're gonna sell, maybe they won't sell. So for example, right, like if you do classes, you know that it's gonna bring you certain amount of money. Whereas if you just make a knitted sculpture, you're not 100% sure, right? So like how do you decide for yourself what you're going to pursue? Like what's more important for you?
Well, so that's hard. Anytime I've really tried to make something specifically to make money, nobody's been interested. I don't know why, but so what I found is that most of my patrons are knitters, and most of them can afford something small. So I will often do, 5 or 6 small pieces periodically, because they fund the large pieces, which might never sell, but which feed me, right? That's interests me to push myself. So I try to go back and, I do a few small ones, because that'll keep me going for a while to do the bigger ones, which are of more interest, which may sell eventually, but may not. I mean, you never know.
But like if money was not a worry, would you only work on like enormous sculptures?
Possibly. Mm-hmm. Although the small ones, sometimes they're a way for me to test a color, or to, just figure something out in a less productive, less intense way. So I guess I'll go back. I don't know for sure. Maybe I wouldn't.
So you mentioned that like you made those sculptures with the staircase of getting out of the cage. Do you have, like, when you think of an idea, right? Do you have, most ideas that you have, are they just like knitting and how you're gonna pose the needles, or are you thinking in like terms of sculptures?
So, I think back and forth. I tend to mostly think in terms of sculpture. Like, I don't want to just make a whole bunch of pieces with knitting needles. I mean, what happens when I start making them is ideas come to me. Like one piece I made just after the previous president was elected is knitting needles stabbing themselves in the gut. And that was just, to me, it was an emotional expression. And so I try to bring more to it than just the knitting. Now, whether or not you see that is, I don't care. You can see it or not, but I think I put a lot of emotion about what is going on in the world around me into my work. And sometimes
in the description of your item, like when you're selling it, like, do you make some card explaining how that idea came to mind, or do you let people see what they want to see in your sculptures?
Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. I don't like to, I think it helps to have a direction in, like to name a piece and have a little description. But that can sometimes turn people off too. It just depends how important it has been to me, how the idea, right? Sometimes I'll just write a name and leave the rest up to you.
Is naming your pieces difficult for you?
Yes and no. I have a lot of fun with it. I mean, I really love words and wordplay and puns, and then I try to tie that in, like as I'm working on something, I usually have an idea of what I think a title would be. But my family and we always go back and forth, and I'll throw out suggestions, and they'll throw out suggestions, and sometimes I have a specific name in mind, but other times I just go back and forth. I really hate artwork that says untitled, because I think the title is like, it's the wrapping on the piece, right? And it's like the thing that leads you in. And if it says untitled, you don't have a lead in. And I just think that's not fair. A lot of people are intimidated by art, and I think we need to connect. Like, I don't want to just connect to artists. I think people in general should be able to appreciate art.
Well,
And
so when people look at your art, right, have you ever been surprised by like what somebody else saw in your sculpture that like you didn't think about that, but they thought it's like about certain thing and you thought it's about something else entirely?
I have, and I can't think of a specific example, but that has happened. But my favorite, I love that people that do a double take, right? They'll look. I mean, I had a display at Vogue Knitting in New York a few years ago. It's probably the first time I was there, and it was delightful to watch people, because they they come up and they look at and they, oh, that's knitting, and then they do a double take, and that's not knitting, because they know it's not fiber, right? And it was really fun for me to have that interaction, because in my studio I don't see that, people don't come in and just look. So it's fun.
So when you were like writing that book, or your husband was helping you to write that book, it wasn't to stop people to ask you questions about how it was made?
People don't, people just don't understand how it's made, right? It's still confusing, even if I explain it. I think I've gotten pretty good at explaining it, but we don't, that going negative, positive, negative, because it goes back and forth, and that's hard. There aren't that many examples of that in regular life, except maybe an ice cube tray, right? The mold is the tray and the ice is the glass or the wax, and then it's glass.
Do you think after like somebody reads your book, they would have complete understanding of the process?
I think they understand it, yes. Now, whether they probably couldn't just do it out of nowhere unless they've worked in glass and wax before. I really think it's not, I teach this in 3 days, and I think you can get the basic idea in 3 days. And often in my workshop, people will come out with 1 or 2 small pieces. That's not going to make you an expert, because it took me, probably 10 years before I really got good at it, and could, reliably be happy all the time with what happened. But the book is just basic understanding. Lost wax casting is how they make bronze sculpture and jewelry. So people who have worked in those areas will understand the similarity.
Right. Is there like a heirloom that you consider like from everything you've made, like something that you would be proud to keep in the family like for generations?
Well, I don't know. I'm always most excited about the piece I just made. But before I was doing knitted work, I was doing faces, and I did both my daughter's faces in glass with, like, one has question marks and the other has fingers coming out her head. So they're strange and unusual, and I'm attached to them because they're my children. Other pieces, not so much. That's going to be up to my kids, right? If they want to keep anything or not.
Do you feel sad when something sells?
Mostly not. I don't know. I think a lot of people can relate to this. The process of knitting something is what you love, right? I love the finished product, but I'm mostly just love the process. And really that's why I do so many of these pieces with the knitting needles in them, because to me, they're like a salute to the work in process, right? It's finished, but it's really not finished. It's still going on because the work is what I'm interested in.
Right.
The
I actually love
making.
that. I actually like really love that concept.
Well, that's part of the reason I have so many knitting projects in process, because, I like it when they're finished, but the process of working on them, I learn a lot about myself and about the world, and it's just being involved in it is what's important to me.
So when you look at the very first few pieces that you made, right, and the pieces that you're creating now, what did you learn? How did you change as an artist?
Wow. Well, I think I've gotten definitely better at my technique. And I've gotten better at increasing the scale. Like I can make larger work than I could before. And I also feel like I'm probably freer with the work than I used to be. Like I'm much less, I try to be less structured. I mean, when I'm making, I want to try to make my work look like real fiber. And I think I've gotten better at making it look more flexible.
Right. So like you mentioned that you need Fair Isle and brioche and everything. And majority of the pieces that I've seen, and I don't know if it's all that you make, it's your basic knitting.
Yeah.
Is there a way to make brioche into glass?
Maybe I should try. I haven't tried brioche, but maybe I did one piece a while ago. It just ends up being more dense, and you wouldn't get the color change that's the problem with Fair Isle too. If I wanted to get individual stitches that were different colors, I would have to cast each piece separate and then attach them together in wax and then recast them. So that's just daunting to me. It doesn't mean I'm not going to do it. I've had that in the back of my mind for a while. It's just really time consuming. So
when you thinking of the future projects, right? Is it knitting inspired? Is it events inspired? Like what brings those ideas to you?
Well, so the pieces I've been making lately are all illuminated, like that black one. And then I've made these kind of gourd shapes that have light inside of them. And that actually I've started showing with a gallery in New York called Culture Object, and he's mostly interior design related. And he wanted me to do some lighting pieces. And initially I was like I thought, I don't know. And then I started thinking about the lighting, and in combination with COVID, I mean, the timing was perfect, because then I started to think of, we're all in this cage, and the light is like, we're the light inside the cage. So that's what's so that has inspired these pieces that are still knitted, or at least fiber based, and yet there's something else. So I don't know, seems to be the direction I'm going now. Whether, I don't know, I still like making pieces with just the knitting needles and the knitting. So I can't tell you where I'm going.
How do you decide like what galleries to work with, where to send?
Well, sometimes it's not a choice, right? I think a relationship with a gallery is like a marriage. And too many artists are so excited to be in a gallery that they don't think about that beforehand. I mean, why would you? It's hard. There aren't many galleries, and it's hard to show your work. But I feel like it's really important to have great communication with a gallery. And the ones I have right now, I trust them. I really like them. We can communicate back and forth, and that's important.
So have you ever considered doing crochet pieces? Or
I have, and I do crochet. It's crochet is more complicated because you're having to stretch the wax more because, you know, you're going in and out and in and out, like knitting is just the one. So I've done some little bits of crochet, like just the chain stitch or single crochet I could do, but I don't rule it. I mean, I have had people ask me, I just haven't. The same with, like, I'd love to do more cables, but cables, I have to cheat when I make cables because I'll do 3 different stretches of wax and then I'll braid them together and then solder them, because the same thing, I can't get the wax to stretch over like yarn. You know, you never realize how much yarn stretches until you are trying to do similar things with different material.
So what's like the most rewarding part of being an artist, and what's most frustrating part for you of being an artist?
Well, I'm my own boss. That's the best thing. I don't have to, I mean, I can direct the traffic and do what I want. And the most frustrating thing is marketing. I mean, I don't want to die owning all my own work. And yet marketing is a different, you know, getting attention, getting your work out there. I feel like I could spend all day doing that and never make work. But I do as much as I can and I don't worry about it.
So when you market yourself, is it mostly through like galleries? So do you do more stuff online, trying to like through Instagram and like social media? How do you market?
I think Instagram, Facebook, I've gone out to things like Vogue Knitting. I mean, they've been great. Vogue Knitting, I mean, knitters are my audience really. But there haven't been any events in person. I did, at the beginning of COVID, I did a few talks, Vogue Knitting Live online. That's just, online is just weird for me. It's just, you don't get the audience reaction, so it's just a little strange. And then galleries do marketing. I mean, I do have my website through Squarespace. I started putting more things in my store. Because frankly, that's what a lot of galleries have done during COVID, is put them all more online. But people, I don't know, I don't buy art online. You know, I want to see it and touch it. And so I think the people who buy from me online are people who've seen my work somewhere else and are familiar with it. I do have a mailing list too. That's how, I mean, I send out a newsletter a few times a year, and the people who are interested, I just try to keep in touch with them, and maybe someday they'll buy something or maybe not. You know, I hope that I'm improving their life by showing them beautiful things, right?
Is it difficult to package it for shipping?
Absolutely. And you learn the hard way. I build wooden crates for everything, just about, unless it's something really small. 3 inches of foam, like upholstery foam, and I cut it all in place around the piece, and it's a day job to pack most things.
So when do you have time to knit?
Well, I don't so much. You know, I'll knit on the weekend maybe, but I work a lot. I mean, my studio's at home, so I'm pretty much a workaholic. That's a good and the bad.
I mean, I find it amusing because you were like, well, I'm my own boss, so now I can work 60 hours a week.
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah, that's it.
Right.
But I mean, my job has a lot of different aspects. So if I get sick of one aspect, you know, I could go from wax to mold making to marketing to computer, you know, go back and forth.
Does that stress you out that you like one woman show basically?
Well, it's really a stupid business model. You know, it's not a business model. I mean, there's a real push to say, oh, you know, an artist, you can be a business, and you can be, but to do it just by yourself is insane. I mean, my husband's a computer guy, so he helps, and my children and friends all help, and my family helps when I need help. But that's real, how many people, engineers don't call their children to help them with their projects. So
Well, they
it's
actually do when they don't know how to upload stuff on YouTube. They call them.
it's just a hard, being an artist. I mean, we don't have, I think in Europe, they have more of a apprenticeship program, which also has its disadvantages, but it seems like a more realistic way if you need to make a living while you learn to make your work. I'm just fortunate my husband is supportive, I mean,
So
he's my
let's talk
built-in
about
patron.
let's talk about him for a second. He's supportive as far as like helping you out with the computer stuff and like marketing and all that stuff. Does he ever complain about all the stash that you have, all the work materials that you have?
He doesn't complain, no, but he said, why can't you be a painter? And I mean, glass is heavy. And then if I don't just have it on my shelves and I have to store it in crates, I mean, I've got crates in my basement. It takes up a lot of room.
Have you ever crushed anything, like finished the statue and just dropped it accidentally?
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Is that heart shattering?
Sometimes, and then sometimes I can rebuild them. I can add wax to the glass and rebuild. That is actually more work often. If you're afraid of glass breaking, then you shouldn't work with glass, is really what it comes down to. I mean, I don't want stuff to break, and I've become more aware of my surroundings and careful. But when it breaks, I have to, there's Andy Goldsworthy did a film. I don't know if you know who he is, a natural artist. He works. So he spent all this time making this, I think it was an ice arch or something. And then it broke. And his response is like, he goes like this, and he pauses for a minute, and then he starts rebuilding it. I mean, that's kind of my approach.
But do you feel like it's also like related to knitting? Because in knitting, like you make a mistake, you can just undo it and restart again, and like it's fixable. Do you think like that's why you like the glass as well, because you can fix it?
I guess. I mean, but most people, I know a lot of people, when I started out in knitting, if I made a mistake, I wouldn't tear it out. Oh my God, waste all that time. I mean, now I've just become more, if it's a mistake, I look at it and say, is this a fixable mistake, or should I just let this one go and move on to the next, right? You can't your work can't be too precious, or you never are going to be innovative, right? Because you're going to be too afraid of messing it up.
Do you ever like have creative block when you don't know what else to make, when you feel like you've made everything you wanted to make?
Well, I mean, a lot of people talk about creative block. I just work. I mean, I don't always know what I'm going to make, but I don't pressure myself I just work, I'll just start, I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm going to go in the studio today, like every other day, and maybe I'll clean, or maybe I will just play with the wax, or maybe I'll finish this piece that I hadn't finished. And then that will just free me on, and then I start working on something else.
Was COVID difficult for you, or did it open more doors for you because of all the people had time and they suddenly were all knitters and more people got interested in knitting?
I don't know that it changed my business at all. I mean, personally, it gave me time to do some experimentation and to finish some work that I had been thinking about or hadn't quite finished. Since I'm just glad I work at home, because I would have gone totally bonkers if I couldn't have worked. I mean, I would have been doing something else. I would have been making shawls, but I process the world through my hands, and I need to be working with my hands. Now, it doesn't have to be glass, but that's what I do now, and that's been my salvation.
Is there like ever a day when you're not creating something?
Well, I've been the past couple days. I mean, I had an open studio October 16th, and then I was gone for a few days, and I came back, and I'm kind of in between things right now, but my studio's clean. So once I start working, it's going to be messy again. So I'm just kind of, doing things like taking the cat to the vet and all this stuff that gets pushed aside because you're busy doing something else.
Well, while you're taking your cat to the vet, are you thinking about what next thing you're gonna make? Like, is your head always working in the, like, what's next?
No. I mean, maybe in the background, but I don't, I'm often not thinking about the next thing. I'm thinking maybe about problem solving, or, I mean, my ideas come from working.
When you came to Vogue knitting, like, is there any knitted items that you saw on the runway there or in the stalls of other people who are selling there that you were like, oh my God, I have to make this into this? Like, is there, like, seeing knitted items sparks your imagination?
I'm much more about the material than the finished product. So I don't even know if I saw the runway show, but I bought yarn.
When you buy yarn, do you buy it for a specific project, or you just buy it because you love it?
I end up buying a lot of sock yarn because I like that weight, and I'll make, maybe it'll become gloves, or it'll just be in my stash, like your stash, and, waiting for a future project. One thing, I mean, on Ravelry years ago, I saw this hat pattern, like this brain hat. I don't know if you've seen it. And it's all I-cord that, yeah. So when I saw that, I made one in knitting for a friend who's a scientist. And after I made it, I thought, oh my God, I have to make this in glass. So I did make it in glass, and I call it, "This is your brain on knitting." So that's the one time I know I was inspired by a specific pattern.
That's so interesting, actually. Yeah. So do you have the plan for next year? Do you know what you gonna make? Is there like something that?
No, I'm teaching in June in Seattle, but I don't have dates yet. And I would like to teach more, but I don't have anything lined up. I'm actually in June, it's not June. I'm teaching in the summer next year. I have a solo show in Asheville, North Carolina next summer. I think, that's the one that's in June. So I'm really thinking about what that's going to be. I'm leaning against having it just a bunch of objects. I kind of want to tie the show together somehow. So that's what I'm working on the next few months, is trying to figure out what that's going to look like.
So let's talk about shipping to the show. What's that look like?
Well, that looks like building wooden crates for each piece, and then putting them on a pallet, or maybe 2 pallets, and wrapping them all up, and getting a truck in to ship them. That's a huge deal. I mean, it can take a week to pack and ship, and it's not inexpensive.
Right.
But I have a shipping broker I'm pretty happy with, and the pallets do end up being less expensive than shipping individual pieces to FedEx, and they get handled less, which is, if I'm shipping multiple pieces, that's the way I want to go.
Right. Is there like a dream of that you would have, like, to have your pieces all over the museums everywhere?
Well, I've got work in a lot of museums. I mean, I'd love to be in the Corning Museum of Glass. I mean, I've taught there, but I'm not in their museum yet. But I don't know. I don't have a specific dream. I mean, I just like to work. My dream is, like I said, not to die owning all my own work.
Are there other glass artists that inspire you?
Inspiration is odd, because there's a fine line between being inspired and wanting to copy them, right? So I love a lot of artists' work, but I don't think it inspires my work directly, right? I tend to be more inspired by like Dr. Seuss and maybe Antonio Gaudi with the twisty towers, and Buckminster Fuller, Ruth Asawa, maybe she's like fiber, that, you know, her work, wire netting, she's no longer living. But there's a lot of amazing glass artists. There tend to be different techniques than me, you know, blown glass. And
is there like a knitting technique that you would like to learn and you haven't yet?
boy, I've pretty much learned a lot of them. Now, brioche was my latest. I've done a lot of lace. I love cables. I can't think of a specific one.
Right. So is there like something that, like when you knit, right? Do you go by your mood? Like, is it just the project itself inspires you, or you figure out like, today I just can't concentrate, I'm gonna work on this? And
yeah, well, lately I tend to work on things that are more portable, like so that I could knit while I'm on the plane flying somewhere, or while I'm talking to somebody. So I'm lately doing less complex stuff. I often like to make my own patterns and just make things up and, you know, kind of structure. And I'm doing less of that just because it takes way more time. And I find I don't have the, you know, could be days to get the whole thing, you know where you're going. I just start playing.
you ever consider design in knitwear design career?
No, I don't have the patience for writing out the pattern, you know, that I'd rather just make it and not have to document it so someone else can make it.
Talk a little bit about your photography, because it must be difficult to be able to show like the depth of the glass and like all the play of the colors. Was that also a process, like learning how to showcase it?
Well, you know, that started from when I was first working as an artist. I hired somebody to take photographs, and the photographs were beautiful, but they were expensive. You know, it was $50 a piece or something. And I just, when you get larger and your work is fragile, the idea of having to bring it to somebody to photograph it, and I just thought, this is insane. You know, it's not going to get, so I taught myself how to photograph, and I took a class, and it was more complicated. And then now I have a softbox and I have a backdrop, and I just pay attention, right? I mean, a lot of photography is just making sure, you know, whatever you see is what you're going to get. So you have to make sure you've got it set up properly. And since it's at home, you know, if I don't like the photograph, I can look at it and say, oh, I need to retake that. Or if I can alter it in Photoshop, I will. I mean, I did spend a lot of time on photographs. And part of that is most people never see the art. Right. You know, when you look in the history books, you are never going to see a lot of that work, especially if it ends up in a private collection. You're going to see the photographs. So now my photographs could be better if I paid somebody, but I'm frugal and stubborn, and I don't know.
No, I mean, I actually think you're doing a beautiful job with them, because like, I feel like it's almost like that glass is alive when I look at it.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me, because I try to make it look like I think it looks, but it doesn't mean that, you know, I can be very critical about it, you know.
So when you think about yarn and knitting, it's something like soft, squishy, warm, right? When you think about glass, it's cold, unyielding, and like the complete opposite of it. Is that how you see it, or in your mind, glass is also warm and squishy?
Glass is definitely not warm and squishy. The thing about glass is it's it's variable, right? The light, you can change it like that just by changing the light or the light source. You can have shadows or not have shadows. And I love that part about it. You know, it still has the structure of knitting, but it definitely doesn't have this warm and squishy.
Right. And you mentioned that you did other kind of sculpture with like metal and stuff, right? Have you ever tried knitting with that?
I have a couple pieces I've done that are knitted in bronze, but I don't have the facilities, so I have to go somewhere else to do that. And, you know, there's always this, I don't like to be one, you know, just concentrating on one thing, but you can only do so many things, right? I thought I would get back to the bronze casting and I haven't. It doesn't mean I won't do some more, but it's a little different to do it. The bronze knitting, the setup is a little different.
When you look at like your journey as an artist from the beginning till now, do you think you like just scratch the surface halfway there? Do you think you like at the top of your career? Where you see yourself right now?
I think I'm still at the beginning, but I don't know. I mean, I've been fairly lucky publicity wise, but I hope I mean, who knows, right? I'm not ready to quit yet, but it's not, you know, there aren't that many artists over 50 because.
Well, I don't even mean age-wise. I mean like the experience-wise and where you like, I feel like I'll give you an example, right? Like I'm knitting for 4.5 years and we talked about it and you were like, oh my God, you're knitting this lace. But part of me still feels like I'm a rookie because there is so many still techniques and so many things that I haven't tried. Like I never knit the sweater, like you know, I just knitted my first pair of socks like last months, you know? So it's like, I feel like there is still so much for me to learn and so much for me to explore that even though I can knit some complicated stuff, I still feel like I'm a beginner.
Right. Well, okay, I don't feel like I'm a beginner, but I think there's a lot more I can do with this. And I'm actually working on some wall pieces that connect. You know, I can't build a large piece, but I'm trying to figure out how to build it in pieces to make something bigger. I mean, the same as the stitches. And that just takes a little engineering and thought, and I'm working on that. But I don't feel like I haven't run out of possible directions. You know, I don't know that I will. Maybe I will. Not there yet.
I can't wait to see what other directions you're going in, and I hope to see some of it one day live somewhere, like whether it's Vogue knitting or some exhibition of yours. I would love to actually like see it up close and personal. I think.
Well, I hope to go back to Vogue knitting when they're in person. I mean, it's always great to go to New York. It is really expensive for me to get there, and you know, my work is expensive to buy, so it's not an impulse buy usually. So when I go to events like that, often it's about getting a mailing list. It's not about selling work. So I have to be in a position where I can afford to do that. We'll see.
Well, thank you so much for being my guest today, and I love talking to you. I love getting.
Well, thank you. You ask great questions. It's refreshing.
Thank you. I'm happy you enjoyed it because I enjoyed it tremendously.
Yeah. Thanks, Irina.
Thank you.